Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the very first session of the new webinar series of the third Thursdays in the Metaverse. I'm Raul Ruiz. I'm part of the MetaverseUA, and first of all, I want to thank you all for joining in this spooky evening to explore critical themes of the future of virtual worlds and immersive technologies. Indeed, our purpose with this series of webinars is basically to offer you fresh perspective from leading experts in technology, law, and innovation. And today we are excited to launch with a topic that's central or key to understanding the advancement of virtual worlds. This is standards and competition and the metaverse and the EU regulatory approach to this matter. We are thrilled to have with us Anselm Küsters, a distinguished expert in competition law and in digital markets. Ansel is, among many other things, the head of the Department of Digitalization and New Technologies at the Center for European Policy in Berlin. And today he is going to share with us insights into how the EU approach might shape the growth of the metaverse and influence its accessibility, its competitiveness, and also its openness. Before we start, just a couple of quick remarks. Please use the chat to submit any questions that you may have during the presentation, because we will devote a final segment of the presentation to discuss any potential doubts that may have been posed. And please also feel free to engage with each other in the chat, or eventually our final goal is to build community and share ideas. So all comments are welcome. And now, without further ado, please, Anselm, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and also thank you to the chair for inviting me to this new webinar series. Today I will present on standards and competition in the metaverse, and this is based on a paper I wrote for the International Congress on the Metaverse that happened this summer at the University of Alicante. And I have to admit, I would prefer to be in person in Alicante because it's quite cold in Berlin today. But since we're talking about the metaverse, I think it makes sense to present my thoughts also in this virtual format and adapt to this new technology. So this paper that I wrote for the Congress deals with the EU's approach to the strategy on virtual worlds. And for today's presentation, I will expand on that, because I have a bit more time compared to the summer. I will focus on standards and competition, because I think these are the two crucial areas that will shape the EU approach. And I will later link to the paper in case you want to dig deeper into that. And in addition, I also added a couple of slides at the end of my presentation to reflect on what has happened over the past year, because I wrote this paper already a year ago, and there have been some changes both in the hardware area and also with respect to regulation. So I will also devote some time at the end to reflect what those more recent developments mean for my argument that I developed in the paper. So if you want to think about standards and competition in the metaverse, my assumption or argument would be that it makes sense to step a bit back and look at it from a bit broader perspective, namely the perspective on the history of technological change and how we deal in societies with technological change. I think a key assumption or statement that most policymakers nowadays have in their head, but also many of us academics and the general audience that reads newspaper articles, is that technology is a powerful driver of societal change. I think most people would agree with that statement. But when you dig a bit deeper and look into literature on this field, there are basically two different ways in which you can frame this statement or this assumption. On the one hand, you can think about technology, about new technology, as something that happens like an external shock. Here you think about technology as an autonomous entity, an autonomous actor that is ultimately not really subject to human control. You might make some modifications, you might delay certain developments, but in the end, this technological change will happen. And if you have such a view, this might lead to some quite aggressive policy changes. For instance, we see this in the moment in the debate about AI, where some people argue it's so risky, it's such a dangerous technology that you should just forbid the development, or you should forbid any robots that are AI driven because they might replace workers. And this perspective we could call technological determinism. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that over the past 2 or 3 decades, the most prevalent framing in the social science literature, at least, has been not one of technological determinism, but a more nuanced argument that basically argues what matters is not technology itself, but the social or economic system in which it is embedded and the people that are at the levers in this system. And this leads to a debate about people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos that are quite influential, that lead dominant firms, and that can make quite crucial changes in the trajectory of these technologies. And at least in the US, this has led to a certain revival of the Ludist literature. So the Ludists were industrial workers in 19th century Britain that basically argued the new machinery that was developed at that time and introduced into the plants was not adapted to their preference, to what people actually needed. And they argued this is a problem of the system, but also of these capitalists that owned the firms and the plants and then just introduced the technology without negotiating with them. And this has kind of led to a new Ludism 2.0, if you want to call it that way, or we could just say a social determinism of technology. So when we come back to the topic of today's talk, to the technology that is of interest to us, we can ask the question, so if the metaverse will be a powerful driver of societal change, how should we frame our discussion of it? Should we look at it through the lens of technological determinism, or more look at the social and economic system and the actors in that system and the elites and capitalists driving that development? And I would argue that for several reasons it makes sense, at least from an EU policy perspective, to go a bit back to this older argument in the literature that technology in itself is already not neutral and has certain political features depending on how you set it up. We could call this thinking about technological arrangements as a form of order. And I'm not the first one to make this argument. This is actually something that goes quite back in the history of science. And I'm inspired here by an article by Winner from 1980 that argued artifacts have politics. And what is meant with this is in this article, there is the example of bridges built in Long Island. These bridges were apparently on purpose built in such a low way that only people owning private cars could commute there on a Sunday for a walk because the cars were small enough to go below the bridge, while more public transportation systems like a large bus could not travel below. So it was inaccessible for certain parts of the population that should be kept out on purpose. And the point to realize here is that, of course, this was a decision made by some people, but once these bridges are built in a certain way, here in a certain low way, you can change the city council, you can change many things, but the technology has this political effect until you adopt it. So this, in a sense, leads to this argument that you can have a theory of technological politics, meaning the technology, when it is introduced, has already quite strong political effects. So how does this relate to the metaverse? Well, in the EU metaverse debate, we can again differentiate between 2 different perspectives. On the one hand, there are many policy documents, especially from 2022 and 23, that kind of had this vision of several metaverses. So there was always this talk about the plural form. And the key assumption here was that at the end of this development, we would have many isolated individual virtual worlds. Some of them may be with EU values if you enact regulation that forces these values onto them. But these are, in a sense, private spaces. Private virtual worlds operated by different companies according to different standards, so they might not be interoperable. On the other hand, I had the impression that most of the literature, actually, thinking about Matthew Ball and others, argue that the metaverse is actually the successor of the internet. So in a sense, this kind of literature imagines that there will be one universal metaverse in the singular, so one kind of virtual space with universal standards that everyone can access. So these are two very different forms of technology, 2 different visions in which you can guide and implement this technological change related to metaverse technologies. So the question then becomes, from an EU perspective, which vision is better? Which vision should guide the strategy that the EU is now developing with respect to these technologies? And adopting this perspective of winner, I'm arguing that this is quite a big deal, this decision. If we implement a world where we have a lot of different metaverses, a lot of non-interoperable worlds, this might, in a sense, lead back to what we have seen in social media. This might lead to closed ecosystems and the emergence of several gatekeeper companies that kind of set the rules of the game. Think about Facebook, think about Amazon, and so on. And the idea is here that many of the factors that over the past decade led to so-called winner-take-all markets in the digital economy and in social media are again probably relevant when you think about metaverse technologies and these virtual worlds. So economies of scale, the more user you have, the better the system works. You might develop strong user brands and habitual usage. There might be also direct and indirect networks effects. Many of these companies have already collected unique data sets that help them now to train AI, which in turn might make it easier to build these virtual worlds by reducing, for instance, the environmental footprint. And overall, this might lead to a market where you have, again, high switching costs, lock-in effects of customers. And this might, from an EU perspective, pose certain risks to consumer freedom and competition in the EU market. And these are values that are protected by the EU treaties. So this is quite bad. On the other hand, if you would actually have one metaverse similar to the internet, this might be, especially from a European perspective, quite helpful, because it might help European small and medium-sized enterprises, and we have plenty of them, to avoid some of the strategic dependencies that they have encountered over the past 2 decades, with respect mainly to US hyperscalers. And if this is a vision that is better from a European perspective, we have to reason about the factors that might lead to this vision. And this is, above all, interoperability of platforms. It might also involve very early antitrust enforcement when some startups that are important for the metaverse are acquired by some of the more prominent big tech companies. And it also entails having technical standardization. And if you have these factors, at least my hope would be that you can preserve consumer freedom and competition in the EU market. So my argument would be that the EU should strive for this vision. This is quite an abstract argument so far. So the question then becomes, also for the new commission that as we speak is assembling itself, what in concrete terms should be done to support such a universal metaverse. And here comes this aspect of standards that I want to go into a bit more detail now. So during my presentation in Alicante in the summer, I showed this chart where I basically showed the value chain of the metaverse. Some scholars use a 7-layer scheme. I use here a more simplified 3-layer version that is also sometimes used in the literature. And it basically argues you have a technology stack at the bottom with only a few players. Then you have a creator economy that's already more actors being involved. And at the end, you have the user experience of basically everyone in the EU market. And for each of those layers, there are different standards that would be required to have a universal metaverse. And today I have the time to go a bit into more detail, so I will focus on the standards that are here shown in bold, because I think those are the most crucial ones from an EU perspective. And to start at the very bottom, there's the need for standardized network protocols. So we have in the internet that we all know about, we have the TCP/IP for packaging data. We also have HTML. And basically this is required for having communication and common presentation of data and information on the internet. And some people argue the metaverse requires just a similar standardization. And if this is true, we have a problem, because so far there are rather disparate scripting standards. If we look at certain platforms that are often associated with kind of a proto-metaverse like Fortnite or Roblox, these platforms use different scripting languages. So here we would need standardization as a way forward. And And you could propose treating these metaverse scripting languages as open standards akin to JavaScript in the web domain. This would help integrate diverse code and content, and would be also helpful for enabling interactions between different virtual worlds. And some of the examples I just want to highlight here or name drop are the Mozilla's Hubs project that I read about. So this enables collaboration in virtual reality across different browsers and devices while adhering to web standards. I also noticed that there are already some existing ISO standards for virtual world information processing and 3D simulation that might be helpful. And then Tim Berners-Lee, who is often called the inventor of the World Wide Web, has also an interesting project called Solid, in which he proposes a web data infrastructure that would help individuals to manage data reuse in different virtual worlds, and what I think is interesting, without blockchain. And then, of course, you have many standardization organizations like the Metaverse Standards Forum and others that are already trying to develop relevant standards here. This is true for this point, but also for some of the subsequent standards that I will talk about. Secondly, there's also the aspect of persistent digital identities. So, of course, we all are unique individuals, and in the vision of a universal metaverse, we would have also a stable, what is called XR self across these different virtual worlds. This would be helpful for facilitating social economic activities, but also economic activities. And it would not only benefit us as individuals, but also brands and retailers. However, it's not quite sure if this will really be the case, because many of the firms active in this space have a huge incentive to rely on their existing identity and access management systems that they have built up over the past decade. They might preserve these infrastructures as a way to gatekeep or to extract rent from consumers. And if this is the case, this might lead to fragmented identities. What do I mean with this? It would mean that you have to create a new avatar each time you enter into a new virtual world, and you might have to sign or click a new agreement every time you do this. If we want to avoid that, we again need interoperable standards here with respect to identity. And there are again some ISO standards that could be utilized. There are also some emerging technologies that might allow this from a more decentralized system. So decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, as they are called, these can be connected with traditional identifiers. And if we look more into the future, more into the direction of science fiction, there are also researchers working on so-called blockchain integrated self-sovereign identities that might allow authentication across platforms while retaining sole ownership for the individuals of their data and identities. And no matter if you support this particular technology with blockchain or not, I think this is something the EU should strive for. It should support this kind of research and help to, in a sense, create a scalable public key infrastructure for the metaverse to avoid new gatekeepers and fragmented identities. Coming to the next standards, we also need standards for 3D rendering in game engines. So what do I mean with this? Nowadays, when we talk about the metaverse, we often think about these proto-metaverse platforms that are already referred to, basically game developers. But in the universal metaverse, you would also have schools, retailers, maybe even cities that will kind of utilize these game engines to create virtual replicas of themselves. And this, in a sense, requires standardization of high-fidelity 3D file formats. And there's a lot being done in the industry already for sharing 3D objects or worlds, for textures, lighting effects, for streaming this 3D content. And according to the Matthew Ball book that probably many of you know, the game engines that allow to kind of implement physical laws into these virtual worlds are the most foundational part of this. He basically argues that the game engines that have been developed by Unity or Unreal are something like the English of the metaverse, so like a universal language. And to check this claim, I have had a look into the last extended reality report for the German industry. And here we can see that indeed there's this kind of standardization already occurring. 68% of the German XR firms use Unity. A similar percentage is active in the Oculus Meta ecosystems, and almost half rely on the Unreal Engine. So we can see that these are really foundational elements. And this is something that, to my knowledge, is not yet reflected in the EU strategy. Next, data sharing will be also instrumental. The keyword here are so-called digital twins, so virtual replicas of physical products. And for them to work smoothly, you will need to have access to real-time data. And of course, in the metaverse, if it is universal, a lot of different firms will be active. So again, for this to work smooth, for digital twins to work in a smooth way, we will need to have certain standards for data sharing. Again, I think the EU could try to foster here trust among the industry and help basically the firms to extend their physical products into the metaverse domain. Especially because in Europe we have a quite strong culture sector that might have certain unique selling points in the metaverse, but we need to help the sector basically to kind of transfer their physical information into the metaverse. Then a key point that is often been remarked in the debate is asset interoperability. Of course, a key attraction for many people is that in those virtual worlds, you can have certain outfits or items that you can then use for yourself to express your identity. And here a key example would be that you code a certain outfit that you want to wear in one design application. And if you want to have one universal metaverse, it would be necessary that you can import this design into various game engines and that you can have consistency for this outfit in different virtual worlds. Again, for this to achieve, we need standardization and interoperability at scale. A key question here is whether this could be helped by linking these items, these assets to NFTs, meaning non-fungible tokens. NFTs have, at least a couple of years ago, been a big buzzword because they promise to offer quite a unique ownership of certain virtual or digital assets. This has been very prominent in the art scene, and here there's some debate if we should also have something similar to ensure asset interoperability in the metaverse. I'm not so sure. I think some of the use cases are still quite underdeveloped. There's also a lot of risk and a lot of scams in this area. But nevertheless, I would urge the EU to support stakeholders, standard setting organizations in reviewing how to facilitate this asset interoperability, because I think it's important for driving innovation from the bottom up. What is also linked to this, and this is maybe not so much in the literature, but this is probably from my perspective as an economist, I think we also need, in addition to this asset interoperability, something that you could call economic interoperability. What do I mean with this? Basically, at the moment, we have different providers of games, different providers of virtual worlds, and they have their own ways in which they try to make money with what they offer. But to come back to the example that I just talked about, you design your outfit and implement it in one virtual world, then it would be helpful if you could transfer this to another virtual world and resell it there. So in a sense, these different providers of virtual worlds would need to have a way to share revenue between them, because you might buy one item in one world and then trade it in another world. And then, of course, both of these actors would be somehow involved. Probably both of them want to have a certain share of the transaction. So there must be some way in which they can negotiate and can kind of link their different revenue models. And this is what I mean with economic interoperability. And I think it's quite crucial, because each of these providers must have incentives to develop their worlds and must have incentives to link them. And maybe we can derive some lessons here from physical supply chains. So for instance, if you think about how containers were developed and over time evolved into standards with respect to sizes, this might help to create something similar with end-to-end visibility, with certain similar supply chains in the metaverse world. But this is just some ideas I have for future research. And then almost finally, we also need standards for privacy protection and security. This is something that is probably often meant when EU stakeholders talk about EU values that need to be there in the metaverse. And I think it's a bit tricky topic because it might be challenging to implement this on a global level, so to have a really universal metaverse, but still I think it's a crucial topic, especially because with these virtual worlds, for the first time, we will link a lot of very fine-grained data that so far have been more or less in silos. So you will have what is called field of view. You will have heart activity that is often measured by maybe your sports watch. We will also have voice recordings, and all of this can be linked with how, for instance, you blink with your eye, and this will be linked in real time. And these interlinkages between virtual reality and biofeedback, I think, pose quite strong challenges for the protection of privacy and for security. And I also think that these challenges cannot be sufficiently controlled by the users themselves or by a free process of market competition. So I think there's still some sense in which we need here a public regulator. So it might be worthwhile to discuss if we also need mandatory standards for data protection, for encryption, and for anonymization. And as I said, I think it's a tricky topic, especially if we want to have more international consensus beyond the EU. So here a task for researchers would be to determine how much data is really necessary for a smooth functioning of the metaverse. Because in a sense, the assumption nowadays is all of this interesting data that we collect, we should collect it because it might help to train AI, because it might help to interesting new business models, because in the end, it might help the consumers, the people. But maybe this is not the case. Maybe there are also certain limits beyond which we don't have to go to offer a reliable, good service for people in virtual worlds. So here I want to point to a key feature of standard that is maybe sometimes forgotten. So standards can help us to achieve interoperability, and that's something I argue here in many cases, but they might be also helpful for setting certain limits on interoperability. Namely, when we say here it is not worth to have interoperability because we have to protect privacy and security, and this is a certain threshold that we cannot go beyond. And here I think there's still potential for more research that can then again be supported by the EU. And if there is not consensus achievable, I think what is kind of the minimum that you could do is here to develop guidelines or even rules that force metaverse providers to have at least understandable privacy policies that empower the customers, the users, to make informed decisions about their data sharing. So at least people should know what kind of biofeedback will be recorded and shared. And then the final standard I want to point to is content provenance. This is maybe traditionally not so much related to the metaverse, but I think it has been has become quite important now with the recent advances we have seen in generative AI. There's a huge debate among creatives how they can be compensated for much of their work that goes into these products. And I think especially when we think about virtual worlds, this might be important because many of the designs that we might see there, many of the creative or artistic things that are put into these worlds might be in the end based on real world work done by these artists if Gen AI is used to populate these virtual worlds. And we already see many bots walking around in these virtual worlds that are driven by a multimodal language model. And here, one framework I found in the literature that sounds quite promising is this Aquila framework. That's a decentralized framework that introduces a strong visual attribution method and is linked with the so-called Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. This is a coalition that is also supported by major industry actors. And the idea is here to have a standard for content provenance and origin. So the standard helps to identify which generative models have been used to produce certain output and which underlying training data have been used. This has been mainly focused now on AI-generated images, but maybe it could be also expanded to AI-generated outputs in virtual worlds. And this might be a way to enhance accountability and transparency of AI-generated content in virtual worlds so that creators can receive the recognition and the compensation that they deserve. So if we look at all these standards, what does this mean for the EU? I have already hinted at this at 0 points, so I try to keep this portion brief and only refer to this one overarching slide. I think there are several ways the EU should support reaching consensus on these standards, most importantly through global collaboration. As I've said many times already, I think you should try to implement its values in these standards, but it has to make some compromises because at the end we need here a consensus beyond the EU. So it's important to engage with the existing standard setting organizations. I quoted many of them. It's important to coordinate with them and especially with US actors. And here I put some hope into the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, which has been active over the past years. And now that we have the US election next week, there might be some hope that this TTC will be renewed after the new EU Commission is formed and after the US has elected. And I think it would be a good venue to talk about also metaverse standards. Also within the EU, there's some homework to do. So there must be a stronger division of labor and responsibility between the EU and member states. And in particular, there are many digital agencies that are currently being set up in the member states for the AI Act, for other regulations like the DMA and DSA. And here it's important to not replicate already work that is already being done, but to have a better division of labor and to see which of these already existing institutions could help with metaverse regulation. There should be also, of course, effective dialogue with the stakeholders and the industry. And here I think it's important to simplify language. Most of the EU documents so far use a very heterogeneous language, sometimes talking about the Web 3.0, sometimes about Web 4.0, about virtual worlds, about metaverse. And I think it would be better to have here a more simplified, standardized language and talking just about the metaverse as something singular and omit those other terms that are maybe not so prevalent in the global academic and industry debate. And finally, of course, there's also some funding that should be granted. There are some strategic platforms like STEP that the EU has set up, but there are also some more ambitious proposals like we have seen in the Draghi report for a sovereignty fund. And I think this is something you should follow up, and here metaverse-related technologies should be included because they might have some strategic value also in the future. So, as I've mentioned at the beginning, this is the paper that I have basically presented at the conference at the University of Alicante, but much time has been passed since then. I've written this paper almost a year ago, and now I want to use the last 10 minutes of my remaining time to just reflect briefly on what has happened since, especially through this lens of competition and standards that I have used now in my presentation. So 2 things to mention here. I think on the one hand, a lot of technology has continued to progress when we look at the hardware, and then on the other hand, also some things have happened with respect to regulation. So first of all, as probably all of you have noticed, Apple has finally launched the Vision Pro that has been much anticipated. It's a high-end competitor, we can say, to Meta's Quest line. There are many reports that are talking about how this sets basically new benchmarks for hardware quality, for user experience. Still, in a sense, it's a prototype that is still being experimented with, that must get cheaper, but I think it could accelerate innovation. One problem I see from this competition perspective is that it might fragment the market in a sense, because the Vision Pro is linked very nicely with the overall Apple ecosystem. So there might be some incentives for developers to focus on this Apple ecosystem and kind of leave out some of the other metaverse companies active in this space and just focus on this Apple infrastructure. And that of course might pose some problems if we think about interoperability and competition that I talked about. Then we have Meta that had some setbacks. There have been huge reported losses in its metaverse-related division, but still, if we look at the reports, there is still continued investment. Some of it is repackaged as AI-related investment because, of course, that's the hype at the moment. But I think it's still fair to say that Meta tries to position itself still as the leading metaverse player, and that there are some long-term commitments to developing the underlying technology despite these setbacks. And importantly, Meta has a large user base and to some respects also maybe a more open approach compared to Apple. So this could help to establish certain de facto standards and to shape the market in a sense that is in line with the company's preferences. And this is something that you should observe closely, especially, and that's the third point, because Microsoft has canceled its HoloLens project. So this might lead to a certain reduced competition in this hardware space. And in a sense, I think it shows that the technology is still challenging, that it develops not as fast as people might have hoped 5 years ago. And it also poses question about, is the market really ready for these products yet? Turning to the second angle, what has happened in the field of regulation and policy. I think here the most crucial aspect to mention is that we had an election in the EU. There's a new commission that is being formed as we speak. It will probably start, if the hearings all go according to plan, at the beginning of December of this year. And there have been several policy documents linked to this new commission. So Ursula von der Leyen, the president, has written her political guidelines outlining her vision. She has also sent so-called mission letters to the commissioners that will take up their post in the next weeks. And if we look at these guidelines, at the mission letters, we see that they are dominated by AI because of the hype. We also see that they are dominated by legitimate security concerns because of the geopolitical challenging situation and Russia's war in Ukraine. And virtual worlds basically have dropped out. They are not a big topic anymore. They are hardly referred to. So this has led to some uncertainty about the future of this EU strategy for virtual worlds. And I think this is a problem because, as the State of the Digital Decade report has just recently shown, the EU lacks in several of the technologies that are important for the metaverse, like cloud, big data, and AI uptake. And this is not just my own concern. This is shared by many stakeholders in the field that have recently written an open letter to the EU announcing a new strategy for a coordinated plan on virtual worlds. And basically, these stakeholders have argued the EU should still continue with its strategy. It should enact such a coordinated plan on virtual worlds, leading to more uptake of VR and AR technology in Europe. This has been sent on 3rd of October, so just this month. It's currently ongoing, but there are some signs on part of the Commission that it has reacted to this open letter, that it's taking it into account. And it will be interesting to observe in the next weeks during the hearings if some of the new commissioners will refer to the virtual worlds when talking about their portfolio. And then finally, I think it's important to say that there are some behind the scenes work. So the Commission is a big apparatus, and even if virtual worlds and the metaverse are no longer in the headlines and not mentioned in these big policy documents of von der Leyen and the commissioners, there's still some work being done that is important from the perspective of a universal metaverse. There's an ontology being developed, the so-called SAREF, Smart Applications References, that will help interoperability for Internet of Things and digital twins. There's just been recently a workshop last month on this that extended this ontology. that talked about the progress being done, and that also mentioned that there are plans to create a European norm for this SAREF ontology that will further standardize its use across sectors. And I think that's really helpful because, as I said, many companies need support to transfer what they basically own in the physical world into digital twins. There's also recently been an announcement on an EU pilot project on Web 4.0 and virtual worlds, and that's closely aligned with the strategy that the EU enacted in 2023. There's an explicit reference to action point number 9 of the strategy. So to me, this suggests that the EU has not given up on the strategy and that it basically has a list with all these action points and tries to fulfill all of them. Action point 9 refers to stakeholder engagement and global dialogue, and in line with this pilot project aims to look at recent technology trends, what they mean from a European perspective, and how to enact more global dialogue. And here, one of the things that are concretely put on the table is a planned high-level global multi-stakeholder conference that should be organized jointly by the European Commission and the Polish presidency of the Council in 2025. So as you maybe know, the Council of the EU, there's a rotating presidency, and Poland will have this in early 2025. And the idea here is to have this multi-stakeholder conference that, again, I think might be helpful for driving this universal standardization that is required. And then finally, one of the big items on the new Commission agenda is the so-called Digital Fairness Act. This has been driven by a review that has been conducted over the past years related to basically fairness in digital platforms and ecosystems. And here the report found that there are some continued problems like so-called dark patterns and addictive design in digital products. And I think they mostly have in mind social media. But still, if the EU will enact a Digital Fairness Act to prevent unfair competitive practices in digital products, this will also, I think, affect the metaverse. And I think one could even use this Digital Fairness Act as a chance, as an opportunity to adapt some parts of EU consumer law and contract standardization to metaverse realities, because some of the reports produced by the European Parliament over the last months and years have shown that there are still some novel legal challenges posed by virtual environments. So one could use this Digital Fairness Act to react to these unsolved challenges and adapt the law. So I think here is a big potential for metaverse stakeholders to make their voices heard, also with the next Commission. And with this, and also with respect to the time, I think it's good to conclude now. I'm at the end of my presentation. Just a couple of maybe implications from these more recent developments. I think there is still increasing competition in hardware and technology, but there are also some dangers for market concentration, especially from a European perspective. We see that interoperability and governance standards are becoming increasingly important, and that the EU should take a more proactive role in shaping these standards and should continue to do so despite the AI hype. There is some fine-grained work being done behind the scenes, and while this is quite technical and maybe it doesn't sound so sexy from a public policy perspective, I think it's quite important for a smooth running of metaverse technologies in Europe. So this is basically urging the Commission to continue on this path with sufficient resources. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. As promised at the beginning, these are the two papers that I basically built my argument upon. On the one hand, you see a policy brief I've written for my employer, the Center for European Policy, that analyzes the legal aspects of the EU strategy. And then on the left-hand side, the paper that I wrote for the conference in the summer at the University of Alicante, that's now being published on the website of the chair, and you can have a look at that as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Ansel, for such a detailed and interesting, insightful analysis on the current state of the art when it comes to the EU's regulatory approach. Also, it comes to show, with this overview, we can see the many challenges that the EU is going to have to face in this regard. I think we do have some questions on the chat. For instance, one person is congratulating you, of course, on the presentation, and it's also asking, how can the EU influence the global setting of this? Does the EU have the power and momentum in the digital market to impose these standards globally? Which is quite an interesting question.
Yes, thanks for the kind feedback and thanks for the question. I agree, this is the crucial question in a sense, and you could say power to shape standards is only something you can have if you have companies that are technology leaders. That would be the pessimistic perspective, and then you could say, okay, the EU doesn't have so much, so how can it engage? Nevertheless, these standardization organizations that I mentioned, they are quite open. You can participate in them. And the problem that I have heard company representatives talking about is that especially Chinese companies are using this quite strategically. They are sent into these standardization organizations in different domains, many of which are relevant for the metaverse in a broad sense. So they have kind of a strategy behind this. And for European companies, it's often a problem that they don't want to invest the resources because you have to send good people there. They have to invest time to think about these standards. They have to contribute to documents, and they cannot work for the company during that time. So one thing that could be done more is to incentivize European companies to participate in these standard setting organizations. And I think there's a good argument to be made why the EU should support this with some money, because it cannot be that the European private firms have to themselves use their own privately earned money to support regulation, because this also leads to certain biases and problems. So there would be some argument to be made for this, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also this answer brings me to pose my own personal question. I hope I'm not trapping you with this one. But precisely, you're betting or you're advocating that the European Union shall pursue this universal or this single metaverse. Then what is the take from other major economies, such as China, which you just mentioned, or maybe the United States? I don't know if you can offer some contrast with other countries that may be insightful in this regard.
Yeah, I think China is probably a separate case. They have their so-called red firewall. They already now don't participate fully in the universal internet, we could say. So why would they do the same? Why would they do differently with the metaverse? So I think they will probably be always a different actor, because we just have this interdependence of economy and politics. With the US, the classic argument that's often made by Anu Bradford and so on is that they just are a bit more laissez-faire. So they already have the technology leaders like Meta, so why would they need to drive the rules? Because in the end, these companies are located in their own country. They have rules that if push comes to shove, allows them certain access to certain data and so on, possessed by these companies. So I think for them, it's quite a relaxing situation. They don't have to be rule setters. From the European perspective, it's tricky. I mean, if we just let this happen, as I said, I think it might risk replicating the scenario we have in social media. Here you could say this is just consumer application, so it's not that important. But if the metaverse is really the success of the internet, this has much more ramifications than just being, behind social media. So I think there's an argument for the EU to act boldly, but it's tricky. I agree.
Yeah, completely. Then we have another question in the chat. Again, congratulating you on the presentation, and then they are asking, what do you think may be the biggest limitation of the metaverse, and how could it be overcome?
That's a fascinating question. What's the biggest limitation? I will cheat and say two things. So the technical answer is probably that the biggest limitation is related to digital infrastructure, so connectivity. You need quite low latency rates for it to function smoothly. And here we have big problems already in the Western world. So I mentioned the Digital Decade report of the EU that basically shows that even within Europe, we are way behind 5G and 6G uptake. We are behind with edge networks and so on. So how can you have a smoothly running metaverse if it only functions in a couple of cities that have the luxury to have good connections? And of course, the rest of the world might be even worse. And so we have to think about digital divides. How can everyone participate in that? Because we don't want the metaverse where only the people from the rich world can participate. Then it's not a true successor to the internet, because that's just the main benefit from the internet is that so many people can participate and you can be an agricultural worker in South Africa and use your phone to check some tips for how to improve your agricultural practices. And so this should still be possible in the metaverse. The non-technical answer is a topic that I haven't talked so much now about in this talk, but that still is dear to my heart, and that's the sustainability thing. I think that's also quite a big limitation. We see it now with AI, how there's this huge surge in energy requirements because of generative AI. In the US, they even are reactivating their nuclear power plants and so on. And if already Gen AI is leading to such an energy surge and demand, the metaverse will probably do the same. So how can we handle this in a sustainable way? And I think that's a huge open question that we have to do more research on.
Yeah, man, you're completely right. We have one last question on the chat, which is related to the role that the worldwide consortium may play, I guess, in this global standardization process. I don't know if you can provide any insight on that.
Yeah, so there are several of these consortiums with different industry participants preferring different forums, but I think the crucial point to realize is here that many of these EU documents say we have to embed EU values in these standards or in the metaverse. And this is desirable. I said this with respect to privacy and this biofeedback, but I think it's utopic to think we can have the cake and eat it too, that we can have this for all the standards. So I think we will need to make compromises, and the only forum for doing that are these worldwide consortia. So I think we have to get into them and work much more closely with them and not just do our own EU workshops here in Europe, but we must work much more closely with them. That would be my main point.
Okay, well, if we do not have any further questions, then I think it's time to wrap it up. And of course, once again, thank you, Anselm, for your insights and your very complete and detailed overview of the EU regulatory approach. I think it was really insightful, at least for myself, and I hope that, I'm sure that everyone learned and enjoyed this afternoon. So yeah, as I said, thank you once again, and also thank you everyone that connected for participating, for your questions. I hope that you enjoy your trick-or-treating this evening, and yeah, have a nice weekend.